What's stronger than vodka and nicknamed the Green Muse by 19th century poets? Absinthe. But here's what might surprise you. The famous hallucinogen myth was mostly exaggeration, and the bans that swept across Europe, they mixed moral panic with commercial pressures. The wine industry and other economic forces played a big role alongside health worry. We'll cover the plant's ancient uses, the science behind the so-called green fairy, why governments actually outlawed it, and how absinthe reinvented itself in the 21st century. To understand all that, you first have to trace it back to a bitter plant with a very old history. The ancient roots of wormwood. Wormwood's story begins long before it found its way into a glass. Records show it was part of healing practices as early as ancient Egypt, appearing in the Ebers Papyrus around 1550 BCE. Physicians documented its value against stomach ailments and intestinal parasites, common afflictions in communities without modern sanitation. At that time, wormwood wasn't exotic or mystical, it was practical. Bitter as it was, it sat alongside garlic and coriander as a plant meant to ease discomfort in daily life. People boiled it, steeped it, or ground it into remedies, often ignoring the taste in favor of its usefulness. In that setting, wormwood was a tool for survival, not a symbol of indulgence. Greek culture carried the plant forward into a different role, emphasizing its significance in childbirth. Women sometimes chewed wormwood to reduce contractions and soften labor pains, a reminder of how potent bitterness was often linked with power. The Greek word for wormwood, absinthian, is often translated as undrinkable or bitter, a label that reveals how unappealing the plant was on the tongue. Yet that very harshness gave it authority as a medicinal plant. It was not meant for pleasure or table settings. Instead, it was a bitter utility, valued precisely for what it could do to the body, even if the act of consuming it was almost punishing. As centuries passed, wormwood stayed relevant. Through the Middle Ages, it appeared in remedies shaped by Galenic medical theories, which tied herbs to the balancing of bodily humors. Bitter plants like wormwood were prescribed when digestion slowed, or when the body was seen as needing stimulation. Some sources describe it being used during weaning. Mothers were advised to coat the breast with wormwood to create a taste so unpleasant that a child would stop nursing. This was not an indulgence or a superstition, but a matter of practicality, and like so many other uses of the plant, it reinforced the idea that wormwood was medicinal, not recreational. The plant's sharp taste also carried symbolic weight. Religious and literary texts often used wormwood as a metaphor for hardship, sorrow, or divine punishment. Writers invoked its bitterness not to suggest intoxication, but to mark suffering or endurance. In this way, wormwood took on a second identity beyond medicine. It became a cultural shorthand for life's harsher reality. Its unpleasantness made it both memorable and respected, but at no point was it celebrated for aesthetic enjoyment. This long history of wormwood as a bitter but necessary aid makes its later association with absinthe all the more striking. When distillers in Switzerland began experimenting with it in spirits during the late 18th century, they repurposed a herb known for its harsh medicinal associations into something designed for consumption and ritual. The shift reframed a plant once reserved for functional roles into a centerpiece of social drinking. For centuries, wormwood was endured for what it could heal. Suddenly, it became something to savor, dressed with sugar cubes and fountains of water. That transformation didn't erase its past. If anything, the memory of its long-standing bitterness lingered and shaped how people later judged absinthe. Wormwood had always been linked with strength, sometimes with punishment, and rarely with pleasure. When critics claimed the drink could cause madness or moral decay, their anxieties fit neatly into the old cultural script that tagged bitterness as dangerous. This tension between medicinal respect and social suspicion would hang over the spirit throughout its rise. By the time absinthe made its debut, wormwood was already familiar across Europe, but never as the centerpiece of enjoyment. Distillers who included it in their tonic were building on a plant with centuries of associations, but altering the context entirely. Wormwood had been a tool in hands of healers and mothers, a plant of necessity. In 18th century Switzerland, it entered the world of distillation and commerce, setting the stage for a new story in which bitterness left the apothecary and entered the cafe. That turning point opens the next chapter in its history, one that would carry wormwood out of quiet remedies and into public obsession. From Swiss tonic to Parisian obsession, In the late 18th century, a French apothecary named Pierre Ordinaire, working in Switzerland, created an herbal tonic that quietly marked the beginning of a new story. His recipe blended distilled wormwood with anise, fennel, and other botanicals, yielding something that tasted as sharp as it smelled. It was not advertised as entertainment or indulgence. Instead, like many patent medicines of the era, it was sold as a cure for digestive trouble, fevers, and other vague ailments. On the pharmacy shelf, it looked little different from countless other remedies. What made it unusual was its bracing strength. More than a bitter tincture, it carried enough potency to shift easily from medical context to casual drinking. Its wider journey began not in taverns but on the battlefield. When French forces expanded into North Africa in the 1830s, absinthe was issued as part of the soldier's kit. The rationale combined folk knowledge with practicality. Wormwood's reputation as a guard against parasites, alcohol's disinfectant qualities, and the stabilizing effect of a stiff drink on tense nerves. In regions where clean water was rare, a dose of absinthe helped mask and purify ordinary ration. Soldiers would have consumed it quickly, more out of necessity than ceremony. It was an improvised medicine that doubled as routine comfort. What changed everything was the return home. Veterans carried their taste for the strong, unusual drink back to France. They had no hand in creating rituals around it, but their familiarity gave it a presence in civilian life. Once absinthe entered the cafes of Paris with their appetite for new styles and spectacles, its destiny shifted. There, bartenders and patrons alike discovered that watching the emerald liquid transform into a clouded, opalescent drink when water was dripped over sugar made it more than alcohol. It became a performance. The louche effect, as it was known, turned every glass into a small public display. That ritual moved absinthe beyond its role as ration and remedy, tying it instead to the rhythm of urban leisure. By the 1840s and 1850s, its presence in cafes was assured. Unlike expensive wines, it was affordable across a wider social spectrum. Unlike beer, it offered a sense of distinctiveness and refinement. Choosing absinthe meant joining a shared ritual, waiting for the slow drip, watching the glass shift color, stretching a drink into minutes of spectacle. Cafes adapted to this pace, and patrons treated the preparation as part of the conversation itself. It was a drink meant to be seen as much as tasted, which ensured its spread across Parisian society. The growth was sharp and visible. By mid-century, El Vert, the green hour, was known throughout Paris. Early evenings meant crowds stepping into cafes for a glass of absinthe before dinner, filling the air with talk and the scent of aniseed. What had been a soldier's ration became a marker of urban modernity. At the same time, its strength distinguished it from other options. With alcohol often ranging between 60 and 70%, a single serving had more impact than most competitors. Still, what captured attention was not only potency, but the developing mythology. Absinthe seemed less like a drink and more like a symbol of the city's intensity. Its spread across the nation was even more dramatic. Statistics from the early 20th century show just how complete its integration had become. By 1910, annual consumption of absinthe in France was reported to be about 36 million liters. That figure illustrates the staggering scale of its rise. Few spirits had grown from local tonic to national obsession at such speed. The drink's popularity no longer rode only on ritual or novelty. It was woven into routine life, accessible in neighborhood cafes and central to patterns of leisure. The contrast with where it began remained stark. In Switzerland, Ordinaire's distillate had been filed alongside herbal cures. In the Algerian campaigns, it had been swallowed as protection against contaminated supplies. In Paris, within a few decades, it had transformed into a social performance stitched into daily rhythms. By the later 19th century, even those who did not drink absinthe would have recognized the sight of sugar cubes, slotted spoons, and the pale cloud forming in tall glasses. Its identity was no longer medicinal, nor tied to barracks. It had become a defining taste of city life. This absorption into the culture of cafes created new layers of meaning. To drink absinthe was to position oneself within a social setting, signaling more than thirst. It was fashionable without being elitist, traditional enough to be familiar but strange enough to seem modern. Soldiers had carried the flavor back, but it was Parisian society that gave it the spectacle that defined its use. In that adapted ritual, the liquor that began as bitter remedy had become a statement of urban identity. By the second half of the 19th century, this statement took on an even more pointed form. Absinthe was no longer just a drink for off-duty soldiers or curious patrons in café society. It began to acquire a reputation among those who imagined themselves outside convention, painters, poets, and writers who sought inspiration in its glass. And in their hands, its meaning shifted once more. Why artists swore by the green spirit? By the second half of the 19th century, absinthe had become more than a café pastime. It was developing an aura that attracted painters, poets, and anyone who sought to define themselves against ordinary respectability. For artists, raising a glass of the green spirit was not simply about drink, it was about identity. It signaled a deliberate refusal of convention, a claim to seeing the world differently. The strange color, the ritual of sugar and water, and the sheer strength of the liquor combined into something that looked and felt like rebellion at the table. One of the most revealing cases is Edgar Degas' painting *L'Absinthe, exhibited in 1876. The work depicts a woman seated at a Paris café, a half-finished drink before her, body slumped and face heavy with detachment. For audiences then, the painting was unsettling. Critics called it immoral, even degrading, accusing Degas of glorifying despair and vice. Some suggested it presented a Paris in decline, where ordinary social activity had been corrupted by this particular drink. Yet the very scandal gave absinthe a peculiar power in art. It was no longer only a subject consumed, but an image that spoke to fears about modern life. The drink became inseparable from anxiety about urban alienation, idleness, and creative unrest. Other artists engaged it more directly in their own myth-making. Vincent van Gogh, often linked with the drink, became an enduring figure in this story. Later writers speculated that thujon, the compound in Wormwood, was responsible for his instability and even his dramatic acts of self-harm. But most art historians and medical researchers caution otherwise. Chronic alcoholism, poor nutrition, and underlying illness explain his troubles far more convincingly than any single chemical. The association with absinthe reflects less a scientific truth and more the readiness of audiences to attach mystery to a drink already seen as dangerous. For his contemporaries, however, the glass on an artist's table had symbolic weight. It was taken as a marker of seriousness, a sign that one was prepared to risk everything in pursuit of vision. The ritual itself made it easy to adopt as a performance of identity. A wine glass filled quietly at dinner, beer foamed but faded quickly. Absinthe, by contrast, demanded attention, placing the perforated spoon, balancing a sugar cube, waiting for the water to drip, and watching the liquid turn cloudy. All this created a public display. To sip absinthe was to slow down time in a space where others were watching, claiming both patience and spectacle at once. For those who wanted to dramatize their difference from the bourgeois norm, no simple drink functioned so well. It was an aesthetic act that matched their aesthetic ambitions. This connection spread quickly beyond Paris. Visitors arriving from abroad often sought out the cafes that offered the full ritual, hoping by imitation to absorb some part of the bohemian atmosphere. They carried the stories back to their own artistic circles, ensuring that absinthe's reputation traveled faster than bottles. Producers took full advantage of this, designing advertisements that emphasized exotic botanicals and hinted at special powers of inspiration. Even without science to back such claims, the aura of creativity made the message persuasive. Buying a glass of absinthe was buying a share of the artistic imagination. The social identity it carried mattered more than its taste. The drink was bitter, often described as medicinal in flavor, but its harshness only helped define it against easy pleasures. It was not comfort in a glass, but a challenge, accepted by those who wanted to appear daring. In this sense, the Green Muse was never solely about intoxication. It was a badge of belonging to a cultural moment that prided itself on living at the edge, sometimes romanticized, often self-destructive, but always visible. Absinthe sat at the intersection of art and scandal, of desire for originality and fear of decline. Over time, this dual meaning gave it lasting resonance. A painting like L'Absinthe could be read as either a critique of social downfall or a portrait of modern truth. Linking Van Gogh with the drink could serve as either a cautionary tale or an emblem of tortured genius. In both cases, the liquid in the glass mattered less than what people chose to see in it. The artist's café table became almost a stage, and absinthe was the central prop. That symbolic role locked it into cultural memory well beyond the era when it was most consumed. Absinthe's artistic reputation endures in part because it lent itself to so many interpretations. To sit with a glass could mean surrender, inspiration, rebellion, or despair. Each viewer, critic, or admirer projected their own fears and aspirations onto the same ritual. This elasticity made the drink more powerful than its chemistry justified. It was not the actual experience of intoxication that gave it cultural durability, but the stories that surrounded it, the images captured on canvas, and the rumors whispered across cafe tables. Stories like these laid the groundwork for deeper myths that would take hold outside the artist's circle. If absinthe could be linked with vision, despair, or genius on one end, it was only a short step to claiming that the liquid itself contained hidden powers. That claim would grow louder, moving from cultural rumor into medical debates and from anecdote into legislation. And that is where the most notorious legend takes shape. The idea that a glass of absinthe could open doors to visions no ordinary drink could provide. The myth of hallucinations. The rumor that absinthe could unlock visions or summon the green fairy was one of the most enduring and dramatic claims tied to the drink. It appeared in newspapers, echoed in courtrooms, and circulated among drinkers who swore the spirit held something more powerful than ordinary alcohol. Even after careful scientific testing dismantled the idea, the story of hallucinations lingered. To understand why, it helps to look at both the chemistry and the cultural fears that surrounded it. The target of suspicion was thujon, a compound found in wormwood, the same plant that gave absinthe its sharp bitterness. Thujon was not unknown. People had encountered it in herbal remedies for centuries. But when absinthe drew criticism in the 19th century, this bitter component was singled out as the likely cause of anything unusual. Part of the reasoning came from early lab experiments. In the mid-1800s, French physician Valentin Magnan performed widely publicized trials where he gave animals concentrated wormwood oil. Some convulsed. Reports of spasms and seizures were exactly the kind of evidence reformers needed to argue that absinthe was unlike other spirits. In practice, however, these experiments used pure oils in amounts vastly greater than anything present in an actual glass of absinthe. Magnan's warnings sparked headlines and political action. But later analysis showed the test conditions bore little resemblance to ordinary drinking. Modern research gives a far clearer picture. Chemical studies of unopened pre-ban bottles found thujon levels ranging roughly from 0.5 milligrams per liter to 48.3 milligrams per liter, with an average near 25.4 milligrams. Those numbers sound scientific and threatening until you put them in perspective. To reach doses that triggered seizures in Magnan's animals, a human would need to drink unrealistically huge volumes, far beyond the point where alcohol itself would cause collapse, coma, or worse. In other words, thujon can act as a convulsant in laboratory settings, but not at the trace concentrations found in properly prepared absinthe. The chemical became a convenient scapegoat, but the real risks always came from the spirit's extreme alcohol content. This is also why regulators today draw careful, but forgiving, boundaries around absinthe. In the European Union, thujon levels in alcoholic drinks made with Artemisia species can reach up to 35 milligrams per kilogram. In the United States, the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau requires anything sold as thujon-free to test below 10 parts per million. Most modern bottles are well within those limits. Compare that with some common kitchen herbs. Sage tea often contains higher thujon concentrations than historic absinthe ever did, yet no one claims it creates visions. The numbers make it clear that absinthe was never chemically capable of producing the hallucinatory states attributed to it. If not thujon, then why did so many people insist they saw or felt unusual things after drinking it? The simplest answer is alcohol itself. Traditional absinthe often carried 60 to 70% alcohol by volume, nearly double the strength of many other spirits. Even when diluted with water, it remained a heavy drink. In the social world of Paris cafes, it was easy for patrons to consume multiple servings, each one stronger than an ordinary glass of wine. High levels of alcohol can easily distort perception, blur vision, and make experiences feel dreamlike. Combined with suggestion, the expectation that absinthe would unmoor ordinary thought, drinkers might genuinely believe they had glimpsed something extraordinary. What they called visions were effects anyone could experience after consuming enough strong liquor. This overlap between alcohol's natural effects and the myth's cultural rewards kept the hallucination story alive. For artists, it was enticing to portray absinthe as a unique muse, claiming that visions fueled their work added mystique. For moralists and politicians, insisting the drink caused madness offered a powerful justification for control or outright bans. For newspapers, stories of a green fairy were far more exciting than reports of simple intoxication. Everyone had a reason to preserve the myth, even when the science did not support it. Absinthe's reputation therefore drifted between two domains: the world of chemistry, where evidence contradicted the claims, and the world of culture, where imagination thrived. Once placed in the public imagination, the hallucination story proved nearly impossible to dislodge. Even today, producers must print reassuring labels about thujon levels, and bars sometimes playfully lean on the old legend when marketing cocktail. The myth became part of the brand. People enjoy the story, even if they no longer expect it to be true. The scientific consensus remains consistent. Absinthe does not cause hallucinations. It contains thujon, but only in concentrations too low to produce more than bitterness. The apparent visions described in the 19th century stemmed from high-strength alcohol and the social context of the drink, not exotic chemistry. Animal studies with concentrated oils created alarms that later research corrected. What endured was not a factual basis, but a heavily repeated association between absinthe, intoxication, and a sense of danger. What made the myth powerful was not accuracy, but timing. It flourished in an era already anxious about alcoholism, social change, and urban life. Absinthe's unusual color and preparation ritual made it stand out from other spirits, and its foreign roots made it an easy scapegoat for fears that broader drinking problems could not explain. Blaming thujon created the illusion of a clear culprit, when the reality was that alcohol abuse, not wormwood oil, was harming communities. This matters because myths do more than entertain. They shape policy and public reaction. The idea that absinthe caused madness and vision-seeing played directly into legislative efforts to suppress it. Regulators and doctors repeated the claim, and entire populations absorbed it as fact. The scientific correction arrived slowly and long after restrictions had already taken hold. In the end, the myth influenced absinthe's history far more than chemistry ever did. Modern chemical testing eventually cleared the drink of its most notorious charge, and those results paved the way for legal resurgence in both Europe and the United States. By showing that thujon levels in genuine absinthe were modest and safe, researchers helped reinterpret the drink as strong but not hallucinogenic. That evidence made it possible for regulators to create standards rather than blanket bans. In short, science untangled the myth, and new rules gave absinthe a second chance. But if hallucinations and madness were not the real reasons behind its demise a century earlier, the question remains: why did governments across Europe choose to outlaw a drink that evidence suggests was simply another strong spirit? That answer lies not in chemistry, but in scandal, economics, and the anxieties of a society looking for something to blame. The real reason for the ban: if nations ultimately chose to outlaw absinthe, the explanation lay not in chemical analysis, but in the perception that it was a social danger. Around the turn of the 20th century, fear accumulated in ways that shaped both public opinion and government policy. Doctors pointed to it in reports on mental illness, moral reformers tied it to falling standards of society, and politicians warned it threatened the strength of entire nations. Yet beneath these warnings, there were events and interests that gave the movement momentum, ensuring absinthe would be singled out while other drinks were spared. One of the clearest turning points was the murder case of Jean Lanfray in Switzerland in 1905. A farmer and heavy drinker, Lanfray spent the day consuming large amounts of alcohol, several glasses of wine, shots of brandy, and coffee mixed with spirits. Among this intake, he had also drunk 2 glasses of absinthe. That same evening, in a drunken rage, he murdered his wife and 2 daughters, an act of violence shocking enough to command international attention. What followed was less an investigation into his alcoholism than a narrowing of blame onto absinthe. Newspapers ran sensational headlines declaring that the drink itself had provoked the killings. Medical experts and politicians quickly positioned the tragedy as evidence of absinthe's unique dangers, ignoring the sheer volume of other alcohol Lanfray consumed that day. The story became known as the Absinthe Murders, even though the crime could as easily have been tied to wine or brandy. Public debate seized on absinthe as the culprit, and reformers organized petitions and campaigns urging lawmakers to act. In 1908, just 3 years later, Swiss voters approved a national ban on absinthe by referendum. It was one of the earliest and most dramatic legislative victories for anti-absinthe activists. The Lanfray case distilled years of cultural unease into one event so vivid that it shaped law. This reaction reveals how selective memory operated. Readers of the time could easily overlook wine, though it represented most of Lanfray's alcohol intake. Brandy, too, escaped scrutiny. Absinthe became the scapegoat because it already symbolized moral decline in the eyes of elites. Artists, laborers, and outsiders were linked to it culturally, which made targeting absinthe easier than confronting France and Switzerland's wider drinking habit. The absinthe murders attached a clear moral narrative to an otherwise common tragedy of alcoholism, turning public concern into a weaponized movement. At the same moment, broader economic pressures shaped how strongly the bans were pursued. In the second half of the 19th century, France's vineyards suffered a catastrophe when phylloxera, a root-destroying pest, ravaged grape production. The blight devastated wine harvests, drove up prices, and weakened traditions built on the steady flow of wine through every stratum of French society. As wine faltered, drinkers turned to alternatives. Absinthe was not only accessible but also fashionable, adaptable to cafes and homes alike. Its affordability and strength made it an attractive substitute, especially as wine grew scarce. By the 1880s and 1890s, the shift was obvious. Absinthe was no longer confined to a few Parisian cafes, it spread across classes. For vineyard owners trying to recover their primacy once resistant vines had been introduced, this development was threatening. To them, absinthe represented lost market share as much as social decay. Defending wine meant more than preserving habits. It meant safeguarding livelihoods and cultural prestige. Wine was tied to the national identity of France, while absinthe, a relative newcomer associated with unpredictable urban cafes, offered no such roots. Economic actors leaned heavily into ongoing moral campaigns. Wine merchants, professional associations, and agricultural lobbies sponsored publications and pushed narratives to lawmakers. Medical claims about wormwood and thujone added scientific gravitas, while newspaper stories amplified every scandal. Together, these arguments created a front where medical fears, moral anxieties, and financial interests reinforced one another. Few policymakers could afford to defend absinthe when doing so seemed to betray national culture, public health, and family stability simultaneously. This multi-layered campaign gained results. Switzerland's early prohibition was influential, and within a few years the spotlight focused on France. Heated parliamentary debates in Paris ran for years, fueled by petitions from vineyard syndicates and reports from public health officials. The decisive moment came in 1915 when France outlawed absinthe, citing concerns about national strength during wartime. Other European countries, and eventually the United States, followed, portraying the bans as protective measures, but echoing the timing of the wine industry's recovery from phylloxera. What gave the campaign force was not any single argument, but the way they intertwined. The myth of hallucinations and madness already existed, supported by flawed but frightening studies. The Lanfray murders gave vivid proof to those fears. Simultaneously, vineyards and merchants had compelling economic motivation to eliminate a competitor. Combined, these pressures made prohibition both plausible and politically popular. At the cultural level, the distinction between wine and absinthe mattered greatly. Wine was portrayed as ancient, rooted in agrarian heritage, and bound to the soil of France itself. Absinthe, by contrast, was cast as foreign, decadent, and destabilizing. Even at the level of symbolism, to ban wine would be unthinkable, but to ban absinthe could be justified as saving the nation. This imbalance explains why reformers found traction so easily with absinthe. They could channel the desire for social discipline while protecting a cornerstone of identity. The ban, therefore, cannot be reduced to a single cause. Medical authority lent credibility. Moral reformers galvanized the public through speeches and pamphlets. The press kept scandals alive. And behind the scenes, the practical economic calculus of protecting vineyards added weight to political decisions. Each influence overlapped until they hardened into prohibition. Once these laws were in place, they proved remarkably durable. Absinthe vanished from legal shelves, not because the danger had been verified, but because a coalition of health fears, moral charges, and economic competition agreed it should be erased. What the bans produced was less a conclusion to debates about toxicity than a social and commercial reset that reinforced wine's dominance as France's proud national drink. Yet prohibition did not close the chapter entirely. The absence of absinthe sharpened its legend, ensuring its place in cultural imagination even as its sale was driven underground. The narrative of a forbidden spirit gave the drink a second life, whispered about and occasionally smuggled, rather than entirely lost. That legacy made the early 20th century less a disappearance and more a long retreat into the shadows, where myths and substitutes developed of their own. What followed was not a clean erasure of absinthe, but a half-life of rumor, imitation, and secret survival that carried its reputation through decades of absinthe. Absinthe's vanishing act in the 20th century. When absinthe was struck from legality across much of Europe in the early 1900s, it didn't vanish in a clean or absolute way. Instead, it shifted into a fragmented existence shaped by workarounds, underground trade, and an ever-growing mythology. To the casual public, it seemed gone, but in practice, it lingered behind substitutes and smuggling routes. This strange half-life defined its 20th century story. One of the most immediate effects of prohibition was the rise of substitutes designed to preserve familiar rituals while technically obeying the law. French cafes quickly began serving pastis and other anise-based aperitifs, often presented in much the same way as absinthe: sugar, water, and the cloudy louche effect that gave the drink its theater. The differences in taste were noted by some, but for most drinkers the resemblance was close enough. Continuity mattered more than fidelity. Sitting in a cafe with a pale, clouded drink still allowed conversation, ritual, and identity to continue. In Spain, production of absinthe, or Absinthe asterisk as it was called, carried on openly since bans were not applied or universally enforced there. This gave border regions a unique role in keeping traditions alive. For loyalists in France, even legal stand-ins carried the weight of memory, serving as camouflage for a habit that otherwise would have disappeared overnight. Along with substitutes came the persistence of illegal trade. Across borders, bottles moved from Spain into France, from distilleries willing to risk prosecution into private homes that refused to give up the old spirit. Some family operations continued quietly in rural areas, producing small batches that circulated through personal networks. In Britain, where absinthe was never formally outlawed, it could still be purchased in certain establishments, though it never gained the same cultural foothold as in France. This uneven geography complicated the narrative of a complete ban. Depending on the country, absinthe was either gone, transformed into legal lookalikes, or still available through tolerated exceptions. For many consumers, this patchwork created confusion. Was the drink truly illegal everywhere? Could it still be found if one knew the right people? The lack of clarity only enhanced its reputation. The harder it seemed to find, the more valuable and alluring it appeared to become. Meanwhile, the drink took on another existence through imitations, many of which bore little resemblance to the original. High-proof, artificially colored spirits were bottled under the absinthe name, their bright green hue crafted with dyes rather than herbs. Some lacked wormwood entirely, substituting anise oil and sweeteners to mimic flavor at the lowest possible cost. Tourists who encountered these concoctions often took them as the real thing, returning home with stories of impossible strength or of visions they claimed to have seen. In truth, what they drank was closer to colored industrial alcohol, but under prohibition, few cared about distinctions. Any liquid capable of being staged as absinthe stood ready to feed the legend. The fakes spread the notoriety of the original even further, ensuring its reputation as a hallucinogenic menace persisted long after science or tradition could prove otherwise. The unintended result of all these forces was that prohibition changed absinthe's value. Once a common cafe drink, it became rare, even exotic. Where wine was everyday and beer familiar, absinthe now belonged to whispers, legends, and contraband. This transformation happened precisely because bans removed it from ordinary circulation. By making it difficult or illegal to obtain, governments elevated the drink's status. Its scarcity enhanced its symbolic power, turning it into the forbidden spirit par excellence. Absinthe's image as dangerous or corrupting merged seamlessly with its newfound scarcity, creating a self-reinforcing mythology. The Green Fairy lived on not in cafes but in rumor, literature, and art exhibitions, carried forward by the fascination of absence rather than the reality of present. Internationally, the ban had uneven ripple effects. In the United States, where national prohibition eventually outlawed all alcohol, absinthe disappeared alongside everything else. But when alcohol returned legally in 1933, absinthe's absence lingered. It remained banned, singled out as uniquely suspect. This gave it a different place in American consciousness, widely known by name but inaccessible in practice. For European regions without complete prohibition, such as Spain and parts of Eastern Europe, absinthe never really vanished, though demand was reduced and it was stripped of its former cultural prominence. Global travelers encountered these exceptions and wrote about them, feeding the sense that somewhere, somehow, the outlawed drink could still be found. In France, the continuity came through pastis more than through smuggling. Beginning in the 1930s, large producers like Pernod Ricard marketed pastis as a socially acceptable alternative, tied to the same café rituals but stripped of wormwood. Its success ensured that the habit survived generations. By mid-century, entire social traditions once anchored by absinthe had simply switched to pastis, keeping the skeleton of the ritual intact. Ironically, this substitution made France even more ready to receive absinthe again once laws shifted, since the rituals of preparation and communal drinking had never truly gone away. This infrastructure lay dormant, disguised, and waiting for regulatory changes that would someday permit the return of the original. What also endured was demand among collectors and enthusiasts who had preserved old bottles or scraps of recipes. Hidden caches held in cellars became precious rarities, opened only occasionally but remembered vividly. Rumors of ancient bottles being discovered or smuggled deepened the sense that absinthe existed in a parallel timeline, always just out of reach. The Prohibition years thus kept its cultural memory alive not by consumption, but by anticipation. A whole generation grew up knowing the drink primarily through references and stories, which magnified its mystery rather than diminished it. This prolonged absence demonstrates how Prohibition both eroded and preserved the spirit. It undercut mass availability, but in exchange it created a myth that could stretch across decades. Ordinary bar culture replaced it with safer or legal imitation, yet every substitution underscored the fact that something original had been lost. Even as substitutes took its place in practice, absinthe's image was never displaced in imagination. Consumers might hold a glass of pastis, but the word on their lips, the comparison in their minds, remained absinthe. By the closing decades of the 20th century, talk of the green spirit had outlasted the bans themselves. As researchers tested old bottles and demonstrated that fusion levels had been overstated, regulators began reconsidering absolute prohibition. Absinthe was now framed less as a dangerous unknown and more as a strong spirit with an unfair reputation. What mattered most was that the cultural stage was set. Demand had never vanished, rituals had been preserved in disguise, and the legend was stronger than ever. The Prohibition era buried the bottle but amplified the legend. So when regulators revisited fusion and legality, there was both appetite and infrastructure for a comeback. The 21st century comeback. In the 1990s and 2000s, regulators and scientists re-evaluated fusion levels and production standards. And by 2007, the U.S. Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau finally allowed absinthe to return, provided it contained less than 10 parts per million of fusion. That single regulatory decision opened the way for legal sales after nearly a century of absinthe. Within weeks, shelves in the United States held legitimate green bottles for the first time since the early 1900s. What arrived was not a dangerous narcotic, as earlier generations had feared, but a carefully controlled spirit that passed every modern safety test. Concrete milestones anchored this comeback. The French-Swiss brand Kubler secured one of the first federal approvals, followed by Lucid, which gained attention for being the first widely distributed absinthe sold legally in the American market. Not long after, St. George Spirits in California became the first distillery in nearly 100 years to produce an American-made absinthe in late 2007. These brands marked a turning point. They demonstrated that absinthe could be made, marketed, and sold as a legitimate spirit, no longer lurking in the shadows of prohibition. What drove the shift was not new mystique or rediscovered visions, but a simple recognition of the chemistry. Decades of rumors that absinthe caused hallucinations or seizures had centered on thujon, yet studies of unopened pre-banned bottles consistently showed only small amounts, far under what could cause neurological effects. Regulators realized that small, enforceable limits removed the last justification for ban. In the European Union, producers were permitted up to 35 milligrams per kilogram of thujon, while U.S. rules capped commercial products at levels considered thujon-free if below 10 ppm. By writing these rules into law, governments simultaneously confirmed absinthe's safety and gave it a new, orderly niche in the spirits market. The first wave of post-2007 sales leaned heavily into spectacle. After decades of being sold only in whispers and rumors, absinthe returned amid bottles decorated with green fairies, Gothic fonts, and imagery that hinted at hallucinations or forbidden thrills. Marketers understood that much of the consumer base wanted to taste not just the drink, but the legend. Even if the myth had been debunked, the appeal of drinking something that once carried the weight of prohibition remained strong. Bars staged the ritual of drip, spoon, and louche as a kind of theater, reminding patrons of how different the drink had always been from a plain glass of whiskey. But novelty proved to have limits. Once the initial surge of curiosity passed, a different identity took hold. A second wave of producers in both Europe and North America began moving away from over-the-top marketing toward an emphasis on authenticity. Instead of boasting mystical powers, labels invoked carefully sourced wormwood, copper stills, and recipes modeled after 19th century tradition. Absinthe now fit comfortably into the larger cultural revival of artisanal spirits, the same forces that had turned craft beer, rye whiskey, and small batch gin into serious markets. Drinking it was no longer framed as flirting with madness. It was an exploration of heritage firmly backed by craft. France carried a special weight in this revival. The very country that had once denounced absinthe most fiercely now found itself reintroducing it into regional production. In Pontarlier, long regarded as the birthplace of French absinthe, distillers reopened that heritage. For French consumers, the logic was not rebellion but restoration. Here was a drink erased by a mix of moral panic and economic pressure, finally home again. By reclaiming absinthe as part of culinary identity, France added legitimacy that advertising in other markets could not. It was no longer a foreign curiosity, but a recovered tradition tied into national memory. In the United States, however, the craft cocktail wave gave absinthe a different function. No one expected Americans to sit for hours drinking ounce after ounce the way Parisian cafes once had, but bartenders embraced it as a seasoning, an accent, and a touch of authenticity for historic recipes. The Sazerac could be made in proper form again, with an absinthe wash across the glass. Classic cocktails like the Corpse Reviver II gained new life when their absinthe component returned to legality. Young mixologists also experimented with contemporary twists, layering its herbal anise flavor against citrus, bitters, and syrups to construct original drinks. In this environment, absinthe became indispensable not because it dominated the glass, but because it offered depth a few drops at a time. The marketplace, while never exploding into vodka-like popularity, showed steady growth. Analysts measured the absinthe industry at several $100 million globally and predicted continued expansion. One report from Future Market Insights estimated the market would reach approximately USD 314.2 million by 2025, with a projected compound annual growth rate of 7.1%. That figure placed it far smaller than mass spirits, but notable for a product once thought to be permanently outlawed. Absinthe had established itself as neither a mainstream juggernaut nor a fading curiosity, but a sustainable niche, supported by enthusiasts and the culture of craft. Part of that strength came from its ceremonial value. Absinthe's preparation process, placing the spoon, balancing the sugar cube, and dripping water slowly into the glass, matched perfectly with the 21st century experience economy, where ritual is as important as product. Producers sold more than bottles. They marketed full kits of fountains, spoons, and etched glasses. Bars likewise discovered that offering absinthe service created a small but memorable event for patrons. In this world of curated drink menus, the spectacle justified its place as much as the flavor. Watching the louche bloom into cloudy white turned each order into a performance, as striking for the eyes as it was for the tongue. Regional differences continued to emerge. American distillers often experimented with additional botanicals, seeking to create novel expressions that blended traditional wormwood bitterness with new spice or floral notes. Meanwhile, European producers emphasized continuity with recipes preserved across generations. Distilleries in Switzerland and France highlighted fields of wormwood cultivated specifically for revival products, appealing to authenticity and tradition. Even distillers in Japan and Australia joined, demonstrating how a once forbidden European spirit became part of global craft production. The common link was quality. Regardless of regional twists, marketing emphasized careful distillation and transparency over myths of hallucination. The drink's re-entry also reshaped its public image. Absinthe stopped appearing as shorthand for crime or insanity in popular newspapers and instead became a feature in cocktail blogs, food magazines, and bar guides. Online platforms carried videos showing the drip and louche, turning what was once scandal into content fit for a new kind of audience. This shift mattered. Absinthe no longer succeeded by selling the idea of danger. It succeeded by presenting itself as a beautiful, photogenic, and historic ritual that drinkers could now legally enjoy. By the 2010s, absinthe had completed its transformation. It had evolved from forbidden poison to heritage spirit, carried by craft distilling and sustained by a culture eager for both authenticity and performance. The comeback was never about reclaiming hallucinations or anarchic rebellion. It was about absorbing absinthe into the same landscape that celebrated slow food, artisan beer, and niche cocktail. Rather than being marketed as supernatural, it was marketed as real, strong, traditional, and carefully made. Absinthe's modern revival was not only legal and commercial, but also cultural, setting the stage for how it now circulates in bars, homes, and, increasingly, through digital performance. Absinthe in the digital age. In today's digital landscape, absinthe has found a stage unlike any it ever knew before. Social media and online platforms have turned the ritual of pouring the green spirit into something millions can watch instantly. What once depended on the intimacy of a cafe table is now streamed through short clips, tutorials, and marketing campaigns. But are these dramatic videos advertising the drink or the myth? Give it 15 seconds and the answer is clear. They are advertising both, though the myth travels faster. Absinthe's visual qualities make it perfect for the online world. Few drinks offer such a dramatic transformation in the glass. You balance a sugar cube on a slotted spoon, drip water slowly, and watch the green liquid bloom into a cloudy white swirl. Filmmakers, influencers, and amateur bartenders capture this transition in slow motion, exaggerating the curling clouds inside the glass until they seem almost alive. The looped clip functions like a magic trick, playing to viewers more concerned with aesthetics than taste. On Instagram, the spectacle is packaged neatly into snapshots that suggest atmosphere and identity. On TikTok, the sequence repeats endlessly with music and quick cuts. The ritual itself becomes content. The appeal lies in how the images are shared, not in how the drink tastes. Much of the audience encountering absinthe online has never tried it. They see it as part of a larger cultural mood, a symbol paired with vintage fashion, candlelit settings, and curated backdrops. Younger viewers often treat it less as a strong spirit and more as a portable aesthetic. A cloudy glass of absinthe can sit comfortably beside vinyl records, art prints, or dim cafes in a feed designed to project style. In this framing, the substance in the glass matters less than the look of the louche, captured cleanly under good lighting. That shift raises the question of whether this new visibility translates into real drinking or only digital consumption. The answer is mixed. Many newcomers do seek out the drink after seeing it online, drawn by the promise of recreating the ritual themselves. Marketing analysts have noted that online distribution has become a significant channel for absinthe's discovery and sales, suggesting these videos do influence behavior. At the same time, a sizable portion of the engagement comes from viewers who watch, like, and repost without ever intending to taste it. In essence, they are consuming the image, not the alcohol. Absinthe becomes a participatory meme, its ritual repeated endlessly not across cafe tables but across reposted clips. Bartenders have adjusted accordingly. In many cocktail bars, serving absinthe now involves staging the preparation with attention to how it will appear on a phone screen. Lighting is adjusted, glasses are selected for transparency, and every pour is slowed down to maximize drama. Some bars even design full stations with mirrors or accent lighting to guarantee quality video capture. Occasionally, new gimmicks are included for added flair. The flaming sugar cube, for example, a dramatic stunt with no traditional basis but a reliable audience online. These flourishes, while visually effective, illustrate how spectacle sometimes outweighs authenticity. The important note for viewers is that the flaming method remains a modern gimmick, not a historical practice. This emphasis on presentation shapes how mixologists experiment with the drink. Standard cocktails like the Sazerac continue to hold their place, but online culture rewards novelty. Creators experiment with colorful elements, powdered flowers, layered liquors, or herbs that shift appearance to make their absinthe variations stand out. Edible glitter or tinted syrups amplify the cloudy transformation, giving the videos extra punch. These experiments often read as visual performances first and drinks second. The actual flavor of the cocktail may not matter as much as the shot that results, ready to circulate in fast-moving feeds. All of this illustrates a cultural pivot. Where earlier generations feared absinthe as chemically dangerous, modern audiences embrace it through visual fascination. It once carried the weight of scandal, now it carries the weight of aesthetic appeal. Its presence online is striking not because people believe it conjures hallucinations, but because it looks unique on camera. Still, a word of caution matters here. Social media sometimes recycles the old hallucination myth for quick humor or drama. Without context, this risks reinforcing false history. Anyone staging a clip benefits from clarifying what absinthe is and what it is not, if they want credibility with informed viewers. What is striking is how this mirrors absinthe's earlier trajectory. Painters in the 19th century depicted its louche on canvas as a symbol of mood and atmosphere, while poets wrote about the drink as more than its chemistry. Today's short videos function the same way. They are visual codes loaded with meaning beyond the liquid itself. Absinthe has become a shorthand for mood, rebellion, or nostalgia, depending on framing. The difference is scale. What once reached the patrons of a cafe or readers of a play now extends to millions scrolling feeds in seconds. The shift also changes how producers think about marketing. For decades, absinthe carried the burden of suspicion and heavy regulation. Now modern producers are able to position it as both heritage and visual icon. Demonstration videos, tutorials, and promotional reels show not only product but also context, turning absinthe into an experience rather than just a purchase. Industry reports confirm that online sales channels and distribution have become crucial for this revival. Many new drinkers first encounter absinthe not through tasting, but through a well-shot clip or a digital shopfront presenting it as an object of culture. The distance between first glance and first sip has grown shorter with every repost. This new digital identity connects two audiences. For enthusiasts, detailed demonstrations on YouTube or Instagram teach authenticity, careful preparation, careful dilution, and historical context. For casual viewers, quick cuts and flashy edits sell the image of absinthe as exotic and stylish. Together, these streams create a dual culture, one committed to accuracy, the other to impression. The balance is not entirely new. In the past, some patrons drank it earnestly while others pursued its myth. Online culture simply accelerates that divergence, offering both at once in endless rotation. The result is that absinthe now occupies a hybrid space, part educational ritual, part visual aesthetic. Someone may never drink it yet still know how it looks, thanks to hundreds of circulating clips. Others may order a glass primarily so they can stage their own video, ensuring its image propagates further. The line between consumer and promoter has blurred. In this sense, absinthe has never had broader reach, even if actual taste remains niche. This lasting visibility matters for what comes next. Online spectacle has secured the drink as part of contemporary culture, but it has also raised new questions about its role as a product. If millions recognize it through images, but only a minority buy bottles, what kind of market does that create? And if curiosity leads to steady new sales through online channels, how large has the audience become compared with its reputation a century ago? Those are questions worth addressing as we turn from the spectacle of screens back to the business of bottled. The market for the green spirit in 2025. In 2025, absinthe occupies a very different space in the global drinks landscape than it did a century earlier. No longer treated as contraband, it now sits alongside craft whiskeys, premium gins, and small batch tequilas in bars and on retail shelves. What sets it apart is not volume but identity. Absinthe has transitioned into a niche luxury spirit, sold less as a commodity and more as a curated experience. Where it once appeared in scandalous headlines or lurid court cases, today it shows up in carefully designed menus and digital shopfronts, marketed to consumers who value ritual and heritage as much as alcohol content. By most measures, absinthe remains a small category, but one that shows consistent growth. Analysts at Future Market Insights estimate that the global market for absinthe will reach about USD 314.2 million in 2025, with projections of a steady 7.1% compound annual growth rate through 2035. Those numbers are tiny when compared to the billions tied up in vodka or whiskey, but they matter when read against context. Absinthe's market was non-existent for much of the 20th century. Its revival has been carefully built around quality, story, and cultural impact rather than mass sales. The limited size fits the way it is positioned: boutique, premium, and tied to an experience, not an everyday pour. Europe still serves as the foundation of production. France and Switzerland, both central to absinthe's original story, highlight authenticity and regional identity in their exports. Spanish producers continue to supply Absinthe, often with slightly sweeter styles that reach broad audiences. Legacy brands like Kubler in Switzerland, La Clandestine, or La Fée in France trade strongly on heritage, presenting themselves almost as restorations of history. Their branding underscores continuity, linking present bottles to a lineage stretching back to 19th century distilleries. For consumers, this framing enhances the sense that buying a bottle is not only purchasing alcohol, but participating in centuries of tradition. Outside Europe, a wider landscape has emerged. In the United States, craft producers like St. George and others use absinthe to assert an American craft identity, incorporating local botanicals, mint in some regions, sage or citrus peel in others. They rarely claim to reproduce the European profile exactly. Rather, they frame their work as unique, rooted in place in the same way American craft beer took on its own form. Japan, where distinctive spirits with elaborate rituals find strong followings, has become a reliable importer and now hosts its own domestic producers experimenting with absinthe recipes. Australia, too, has joined the scene, blending European inspiration with local distilling practices. By 2025, bottles labeled as absinthe come from nearly every continent, though always in small runs. This patchwork has created a tiered market. Entry-level bottles, generally produced at scale and often aimed at cocktail bars needing steady stock, sell in North America in the range of $40 to $60, with lower pricing in European shops where taxes and tariffs differ. At the next level, artisanal bottles run between $100 and $150, with producers emphasizing precise sourcing. Wormwood harvested in named valleys, copper stills dating back generations, or mountain spring water. Beyond these, collector editions push into higher territory, marketed less as liquor and more as cultural artifacts. In each case, the narrative, region, method, authenticity, and ritual adds as much perceived value as the liquid itself. Prices vary, but the general pattern holds. Affordable bottles for regular service, premium releases aimed at dedicated enthusiasts, and limited runs carrying the aura of rarity. The division between industrial and artisanal production is not unique to absinthe, but it shapes the category distinctly. Industrial producers move volume by emphasizing accessibility, ensuring that bars in urban centers can serve cocktails like the Sazerac or Corpse Reviver 2 without drawing too heavily on premium stock. Artisanal producers, on the other hand, pursue prestige by promoting symbols of heritage. They sell not just a drink, but an aesthetic supported by special spoons, fountains, and full sets of glassware. Both sides of the market coexist, with each helping preserve absinthe's profile in different ways. One provides reach, the other depth. Together, they stabilize a spirit that once disappeared entirely from commerce. Geography also defines consumer patterns. In continental Europe, absinthe retains its cultural context, integrated into tourism in Switzerland or heritage marketing in France. Local cafes may present it as an emblem of history, linked to artists and poets of earlier generations. In the United States, consumption clusters around craft cocktail programs, particularly in cities like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. Bars showcase absinthe less as a drink ordered repeatedly in an evening and more as an indispensable ingredient or a one-time ritual. In Asia, curiosity and appreciation for elaborate preparation have positioned Japan at the center of demand, with Australia showing similar appetite through craft distilling and imports. The pattern is consistent. Absinthe rarely dominates bar menus, but where it appears, it signals style, ritual, and different. Consumer behavior explains these patterns. Absinthe in 2025 is not a high-frequency purchase. It is an event. Buyers approach it as a special edition, often with the intent to recreate the ritual at home or to share it in a small social gathering. Many bottles are purchased for occasions rather than routine drinking. Sets with drippers, fountains, or spoons are commonly bundled with sales, confirming that what is being marketed is ceremony. This aligns with global shifts in alcohol consumption, premiumization, slower drinking, and an emphasis on quality and narrative. Rather than competing with vodka on repeat volume, Absinthe has found stability by orienting itself around singular, memorable experiences. Bars reinforce this pattern through pricing. Absinthe service is consistent with premium cocktails, often costing more than standard mixes because presentation is built into the charge. When patrons order Absinthe, they pay for the fountain, the drip, and the performance as much as the spirit itself. That pricing logic extends into retail. When drinkers expect a bottle to serve as centerpiece for gatherings, they accept higher prices in exchange for the promise of heritage and spectacle. This business model allows small distilleries to survive by targeting fewer buyers at higher margins, preserving a stable, if narrow, market niche. In discussions of the wider spirits industry, Absinthe shows why market share and cultural impact often diverge. Statistically, its footprint is small, a fraction of global sales compared to whiskey or tequila, yet its visibility is unusually strong relative to its size. A cocktail recipe calling for an absinthe rinse signals knowledge of history. A display of sugar cubes and spoons on social media can circulate as readily as images of fine dining or latte art. The strength of Absinthe's brand identity exceeds its numbers, ensuring that while it may remain niche, it is far from invisible. The transformation is striking when set against its 20th century band. Once vilified, Absinthe is now marketed around heritage and refinement. The ghost of scandal trails behind it, but as a kind of asset, a spirit once outlawed, now recovered, sold as premium experience. Distillers underline authenticity, bartenders dramatize service, collectors seek ornate bottles. A purchase today does not suggest marginality or danger, but taste and awareness. Consumers are buying more than liquor. They are buying the story of revival. Absinthe in 2025 occupies a paradox. It remains small in market numbers but large in cultural presence. Its growth rests on craft values, premium experiences, and an aesthetic formed by both history and ritual. The bottle on a shelf is not just another spirit but a curated symbol, presented as heritage reborn. And in a world where experiences outpace commodities, that positioning continues to attract buyers at every scale. The broader implications reach beyond market data. Absinthe's resurgence has shown that even a spirit once banned and maligned can thrive in a carefully shaped niche. It demonstrates how much modern consumers will pay for narrative and ritual, and how cultural imagination can sustain a product long after mass popularity has faded. With pricing tiers balancing accessibility and prestige, and with producers spread from Europe to the Pacific, the category appears steady if not large. What sets it apart is its dual identity. A drink defined as much by atmosphere and performance as by flavor. This positioning carries consequences for where it enters culture next. Absinthe does not spread primarily through supermarkets or mass advertising. Instead, it thrives where ritual can be staged publicly, where spectacle and slow preparation still matter. Recognizing that helps explain why its presence still grows in certain spaces, even when its sales remain modest overall. The spirit may be strongest when not hidden in cabinets, but set on full display. Why absinthe bars are back? Walk through the nightlife districts of New York, London, or Tokyo today, and you may notice something surprising. Alongside cocktail lounges and speakeasies are bars dedicated almost entirely to absinthe. In cities where every square foot of real estate counts, owners have chosen to center an entire venue around a drink that spent most of the last century in legal exile. The question practically asks itself, why, after so many decades, are absinthe-focused bars returning in the 2020s? The answer lies less in old legends of hallucinations than in how people want to drink now. Absinthe bars succeed by selling ritual. Where quick pours of vodka or ready-to-drink can dominate convenience culture, absinthe demands slowness and intention. The preparation requires precise tools, dripping water, time for the louche to bloom in the glass. It cannot be rushed or tossed back in a shot. Patrons gather and watch, lingering as the drink transforms. That performance is inseparable from its appeal. Unlike cocktails that arrive on the table mixed and finished, absinthe creates a spectacle as it is made. In that sense, the bar is not just serving alcohol, it is selling an experience. This orientation fits cleanly into a broader craft cocktail culture. Over the past 2 decades, bars have thrived not just by stocking rare spirits, but by staging drinks as performances. Think of a bartender flaming an orange peel or slowly clarifying a milk punch. The act itself carries as much value as the taste. Absinthe's preparation is ready-made for this stage. Ornate fountains, sugar cubes balanced on spoons, the slow swirl of white clouds overtaking green. It is theater in a glass. Customers photograph it, film it, and remember it precisely because it feels different from ordinary bar service. In a market where small experiences matter, absinthe is perfectly suited. There is also the allure of rediscovery. Unlike whiskey or gin, which have been commercially available all along, absinthe disappeared for nearly a century. That lost history gives it character. Ordering it feels like unlocking an old ritual one outsiders may not know. For younger drinkers especially, consuming something framed as hidden or rare adds symbolic value. Going to an absinthe bar feels less like ordering a gin and tonic and more like joining a cultural secret. Even though bottles have sat on liquor store shelves for more than a decade, the bar setting makes the act special. The ritual also encourages community. Because the drink takes time, groups tend to participate as a shared activity. They stand around a fountain, watch glasses fill, and wait as the louche appears. The ritual slows the pace of conversation and turns the act of drinking into a collective pause. With vodka shots or mixed drinks, a patron may finish quickly and move on. With absinthe, the table lingers, the atmosphere stretches. In places where nightlife often feels rushed and transactional, that enforced slowness has value. Customers leave remembering not just what they drank, but the pace at which they drank it. Some contemporary examples highlight how bars harness this quality. In London, the Absinthe Parlour at the Last Tuesday Society has made ritual the centerpiece, combining service with tasting sessions and educational programs. It is less about intoxication and more about helping patrons learn the history, tools, and myths surrounding the drink. Similarly, Devil's Botany, London's first dedicated absinthe distillery and bar in Leighton, anchors its identity on absinthe alone. Guests encounter not only cocktails, but also curated flights structured around production and tradition. These venues demonstrate how an absinthe bar works in practice. Performance, learning, atmosphere, all wrapped in a single presentation. In Tokyo, where meticulous presentation already defines much of drinking culture, absinthe fits seamlessly. Bars there adapt fountains into minimalist designs, balancing Japanese aesthetics with European ritual. Patrons treat the service almost like a tea ceremony, precise, slow, and communal. Across these settings, absinthe adapts to its cultural environment while still relying on the same essentials. The drip of water, the opaque swirl, the patient preparation. The details shift, but the ritual is constant. What keeps these establishments thriving is the business logic built into the ritual. A whiskey bar may attract customers with rare bottles, but each pour is straightforward. An absinthe bar thrives on time. Patrons are not paying for efficiency, they are paying for the pause. The ritual slows service on purpose, encourages longer visits, and supports higher pricing per table. Bars monetize the performance just as much as the alcohol itself. The margin lies in making the glass of absinthe feel like a ceremony worth staying for. Social media amplifies this effect. The preparation photographs beautifully, and bar owners know it. Lighting is arranged to highlight the drip of water through glass. Fountains and spoons are chosen with design in mind, ensuring they look striking on camera. Patrons film their drinks, post short clips, and spread the image instantly to thousands. Each post acts as advertising, drawing new customers curious to replicate the experience. Bars now structure part of their service as staged content. The entire ritual becomes camera-ready marketing. The online world and the physical bar reinforce one another. Discovery happens digitally, satisfaction happens in person. There is also a generational resonance. In an era where much of social life runs at digital speed, absinthe provides an analog counterpoint. To order it is to commit to something slower, communal, and more tactile than swiping on a screen. The ritual has almost meditative qualities. It is not only entertainment, but also counterbalance, reminding drinkers that not every moment is meant to be rushed. That rhythm makes sense in today's world, which is constantly toggling between immediacy online and longing for tangible pauses offline. Absinthe bars have, in effect, turned what was once a social liability into an advantage. The same theatricality that critics once labeled dangerous or decadent is now the selling point. The spectacle draws attention, the slowness builds atmosphere, and the history turns ordinary drinking into something more. That combination, ritual, experience, performance, and cultural resonance, explains why these venues continue to appear in competitive urban market. What emerges is a new equilibrium. Absinthe no longer frightens lawmakers with talk of madness or hallucinations, nor does it hide exclusively in craft cocktail lists. Instead, it thrives in dedicated bars that use its elaborate preparation as their identity. These bars succeed by balancing heritage and entertainment, teaching customers that ritual is both the product and the performance. The revival of absinthe bars offers a final lesson. Myths may fade, bans may lift, but the qualities that once made absinthe distinctive still matter. In a culture shaped by speed and repetition, people will pay to sit, watch, and wait for transformation in a glass. That symbolic transformation makes absinthe commercially viable today, not as quick intoxication, but as immersive experience. These spaces remind us that absinthe's power has always rested as much in what people imagine as in what they taste. And in that recognition, we see why the story of this spirit continues to unfold right up to the present moment, preparing the ground for the broad arc of its history that stretches backward through centuries of medicine, art, scandal, and survival. Absinthe's journey runs like a three-act story. It began as a bitter medicinal plant, grew into a myth of danger and rebellion, and now survives as a crafted ritual, green, strong, and carefully revived. Today, the Green Fairy is less about hallucinations and more about the spectacle and heritage poured into every glass. So is the fairy real? The short answer. The fairy was mostly a story, but the drink is very real. Would you try absinthe? Yes or no? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more surprising histories.